Okay, well, it's great to meet those of you who I haven't met, and it's great to see those of you who I have. I would say good morning, but I don't want to exclude Ed. So, hello, good day to all of you. I'm happy to be here. Um, for what it's worth, I have been a faithful user of Dovetail Research since around 2010. And as Katie mentioned, a member of the board since I think 2020. So we started in full on COVID times. But professionally, the common thread has always been marketing and communications. I received an MBA with a focus on marketing. I've done consumer packaged goods and then moved into really sort of services. And I started in the forestry sector. I kind of received an honorary forestry education at Enviva beginning in 2010. And in that capacity, that's where Katie and I met. I headed up the sustainability and communications for them, along with several other work streams. And then I went on to SFI, the Sustainable Forestry Initiative, to lead their marketing communications for a couple of years. And then in 2017, I started Wood & Company. In a nutshell, we're a small strategic marketing and communications firm. We focus on the sustainability and environmental space. We really try to work to bridge the gap between science, policy, and certainly public perception through targeted communications and strategy. And we sometimes partner with Dovetail on projects, which has been a delight. So 9 years on, I can't believe that, but I still love my company. I love my team. I love our mission. And, I've been at this job in this role for the longest chunk of time in my career, and I'm never bored. The work matters, as I know you all feel the same about your work. And like you, I feel a real sense of fulfillment working on these shared goals with our clients, but also a sense of urgency given the current context. My relevant experience for today's discussion really began at Enviva, as I said. They are, for those of you who are not familiar with the company, they're one of the world's largest producers of wood pellets. And I was there for about 5 years, leading sustainability and communications. And then most recently, as Katie mentioned, I stepped into, it was a contract position. I was still at Wood & Company, but I stepped into lead the U.S. Industrial Pellet Association, or known as USIPA, as executive director for about a year and a half. And I really, that role caught me up really quickly, up to speed on sort of a global view of current biomass policy, trends, trade, and certainly the role of sustainable forestry in sort of the current energy transition that we're seeing. So Katie and Maria asked me to talk about bioenergy today. I'm going to be a little bit rebellious. I don't have slides. I hope that's okay. I do have a couple of visuals, maybe that if the conversation flows in that direction, Maria, if I could share my screen, I'll do so. But I really want this to be conversational. I want it to be a discussion. I want you all to think about questions that the burning biomass and bioenergy questions you've always had. And I may not have the answers to everything, but I definitely want it to be an informal discussion rather than a formal presentation. So I think we can't really start about this conversation if we don't have a little bit of history. So, and I know many of you, I will be telling you stuff you already know, but just take me with a big chunk of salt. But essentially, what I'll be talking about, biomass is very broad, right? I mean, pig droppings, chicken droppings, food waste, et cetera. But what I'll be talking about is woody biomass, which refers to sort of the organic material that comes directly from trees, obviously, and also woody plants to some extent, including forest residues like branches, treetops, slash, bark after a logging or a harvest. Wood processing residues like sawmills, residues, sawdust, chips, scraps, etc. And then to a lesser extent, urban wood waste and dedicated energy crops. But for the industrial scale bioenergy space, it's really that wood, that homogeneous wood raw material that we're talking about, and less so energy crops, et cetera. And essentially, biomass, woody biomass in particular, was recognized by the EU back in the early aughts. It was considered renewable energy and part of the renewable energy directive. And so it was included as a way for member states or countries to meet their renewable energy requirements. The EU really has a carrot and stick sort of approach to their renewable energy regulations. There's a carrot in the form of an incentive or a subsidy to companies and member states that are trying to transition and transition away from fossil fuels. There's also a stick in the form of, often in the form of like a carbon tax or other penalty if you don't meet those renewable energy criteria. And so essentially, when used as a fuel, this woody biomass can be converted into heat, electricity, or any kind of bio-based products. And because basically it's being able to release the energy stored and captured by the sun through photosynthesis. So it's pretty basic process that turns into a very complicated topic for many, many reasons. And I'll go into some of those. But essentially, what has happened, we've used wood biomass for millennia for heat and light and other sources of energy. But in the past, say, 15 to 20 years, what really has changed is the scale of that usage. In the U.S. Southeast, which is, of course, the known as the wood basket of the U.S., right now, I think it's about 4 to 6% of the harvests go into wood pellet manufacturing. That's over all forest products industries. And that usually is certainly forest harvest residues or sawmill residues. But wood pellets are basically densified woody biomass. So they look like rabbit food. They are usually between 6 and 10 millimeters, I would say, in diameter, and a few centimeters long, and they are dry. They have about 6% moisture versus, say, 50% for wood chips or more. They're very high in energy density. So they do mimic coal, which is a key market driver for large scale usage. They burn cleanly and consistently, so especially if it's homogeneous wood pellets, right? So it's just wood. There are no additives. The lignins in the wood melt as part of the process to like keep that pellet together. So it's a really good replacement for coal in large industrial scale utilities. And so outside of the specification, it also is economic. And Cole Thomas, this might be of interest to you, because one of the reasons that the EU was able to really recognize wood pellets as a viable renewable material is because it basically saved the utilities from having to build new infrastructure to support wind and solar. They basically had to retrofit their existing old yucky coal utilities to use woody biomass, and had to basically retrofit it and make sure it was running cleanly, obviously, according to all the regulations. However, it didn't take a tremendous amount of capital. So it was an economic way for the EU to transition. And so that's why it's always been seen as a bridge, because it's not going to replace wind and solar. It complements wind and solar in a couple of ways, economically, like I just discussed, but also it's a baseload power. Coal provides a constant baseload power is what they, if you need more energy, if it's really cold, you can turn the heat up. If you need less, you can turn it down. And it's a very useful way to regulate electricity. Um, Pellets provide that as well versus other renewable energy sources. So that's sort of the historical context. When the Renewable Energy Directive first was signed in the early 2000s, um, we saw the growth of the wood pellet industry, especially in the U.S. Southeast. Now, a couple of reasons for that. One, it became a market in Europe to do so. Two, there was also a correlating, or I should say, a coincidental decline in pulp and paper. And so while the wood pellet industry was mostly using residues, if there were not markets for pulp wood, they would also use that. Remember that pulpwood and anything below it can't really be used for solid wood products. So it can't be used for furniture, it can't be used for telephone poles or flooring or anything like that. And so if there weren't pellet or paper or composite board markets, the landowner would have no place to sell his or her residue material. And so you saw a decline in the paper industry and a growth in pellets. You saw policy that was supportive of that. So, recognizing wood biomass as a renewable raw material. And then what you began to see, whether it wasn't necessarily in regulation, but you saw, for example, in Asia, in South Korea and Japan, mimicking the Renewable Energy Directive and mimicking the sustainability criteria around that. So Europe was definitely the first, and I'm including UK. I recognize Brexit, but I'm just including the UK in this as well. And the UK had a very strong incentive plan. At the time, it was called Renewables Obligation. They have basically to try to subsidize big utilities that wanted to convert to biomass. Drax is the best known one. It was a massive utility, and I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but massive utility that completely converted to biomass usage. And there were others as well. And then in the EU, the primary member states converting were the Netherlands, Belgium to some extent, especially in the Flanders region, and Denmark in Scandinavia. So you had basically a pipeline established based on wood pellets, which was interesting. So as this industry grew, so did the scrutiny. And so as the supply chain grew, so did the scrutiny of that as well. So you began to see, you began to see subsidies and incentives for co-firing biomass in coal plants or completely converting the plants. The subsidies and the correlating carbon tax served as a carrot and a stick to help propel the large scale biomass to happen. We had been using in the US pellets for wood stoves, grills, very localized combined heat and power, but never to this extent. And so really starting in the 2010s, you saw the industry start to grow with a few big power players, Enviva being one of them. And those subsidies help to offset the costs of the growth of the industry. And that's true for many new industries, right? You're always going to have some sort of support structure, whether it's subsidies or other, to try to offset the inherent costs of starting an industry from the ground up. So as far as the US goes, I get often asked about the US. Why hasn't this become an issue, a thing in the US? Well, basically, the US loves its coal. We source it domestically. It's cheap. It's not expensive to transport through the rail system, not the trails, the rails, the trains is what I meant to say. And it's really hard to break that habit for the US. Not to mention big lobbying, right? So that's huge. Now we do see some bioenergy locally. You'll see chip um, utilities, small utilities, local utilities. You see combined heat and power using wood chips, et cetera, but you don't see it on the grand scale that you see in Europe and the UK. And that's primarily because of policy drivers. There just has not been an incentive. With the IRA, there were incentives, right? And so that started to like shine a little bit of light on the potential growth of bioenergy. With the Trump administration, that has slowed that down significantly, along with all the other renewables. So, and I can get into detail a little bit on that. The ins and outs of the IRA, I only know the top lines of the ones that affect the renewable energy aspects of it. But suffice it to say, we're not where Europe is in any stretch of the imagination in terms of renewable energy and certainly bioenergy. At a large utility scale. Let's see. So as part of this supply, or as part of this growth, the industry built a supply chain, including manufacturing, storage, truck, train, barge transport, port operations, or massive port operations on the East Coast and the Mid-Atlantic, and the Gulf Coast, transatlantic shipping infrastructure. And what's exciting is that this supply chain, which has been audited by third-party certification organizations multiple times and is well established, will be and can be used in the future for additional applications, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But I think it's very exciting. The bioenergy aspect of biomass is just the start, and I truly believe that. I think it will be able to evolve into decarbonizing many different applications as we move away from fossil fuels. And I'm still confident that we're going to move away from fossil fuels. Okay, so in terms of regulation, I took some notes because this is like, so at a glance, essentially, you have policies that support the growth of bioenergy in particular, excuse me, with the Renewable Energy Directive. That directive has had multiple iterations. It's now on 3, I think, and they're already looking at 4. And each iteration of the RED takes a hard look at sustainability criteria and caps on support for certain types of biomass. It talks about what we hear about as the cascading principle, which is essentially cherry picking what wood can and cannot be used for and regulating that. The US's approach, or the US's certainly the pellet industry's perspective on that, is that actually the US already has a cascading principle well in place, and it has worked for 100 years in terms of economics. So if you look at the pricing of slash, treetops, branches, et cetera, it's between a few cents to a couple dollars maybe per ton, versus saw timber that might go for $20 to $30 a ton. So let me go down to this slide. I just have 2 slides here. So basically, this idea of the cascading principle, Europeans often create laws and in sort of their box without any windows, and certainly without any real understanding of the US forest market characteristics, forest ownership characteristics, and that kind of thing. And so the idea that, oh, we really should dictate what can be used for bioenergy and what cannot should be regulated. And I guess in theory, that is a good idea. It will prevent, wood that could be used as long-term carbon storage from being burned at a utility. But to regulate that and to track it and to try to figure out how to manage that is really unrealistic. And so what we've been able to try to convince them of pretty convincingly is that the cascading principle actually works. If you see, telephone poles and electricity poles are the most expensive solid wood that you have. I think it may have changed. There are a few others, but this is really the tall, straight trees have a very high value. And then, of course, saw timber. You have hardwood saw timber, which is traditionally a little bit more expensive than pine or softwood timber. And then down on the bottom, you've got the pulpwood, which would go into the paper mills if there are paper markets around. And also, softwood and hardwood pulpwood. And then the slash, which is everything else, right? So you've got treetops and branches and so forth. So you'll hear a lot that the biomass market, and specifically the wood pellet market for energy, is using whole trees or clear cutting whole forests to go into the bioenergy market. That's not factual, but we can prove that because a wood broker or a logger is not going to sell something to a pellet mill for $3 a ton when he or she could sell it to the saw timber market for $40 a ton. It just doesn't. It makes no common or rational sense. And so we've been able to actually show that and bring people over to the forest, talk to the landowners, talk to the loggers, see a harvest deck, see the merchandising on that harvest deck going on. The logger putting the saw timber in one pile and the veneer in another pile, or the wood to be used in veneer in another pile, and so on and so forth. Pulpwood and then slash. And so that's an effective way. So I will stop sharing here. There we go. And so monitoring the policies and convincing the policymakers who are also being bombarded with information that may not be completely factual and very emotional. There are some campaign organizations, environmental campaign organizations, that have an interest in making sure that this industry does not go forward so that the wind and solar industry can go further, or goodness forbid, the coal industry actually staying in place. Ironically and oddly enough, some organizations are actually pushing for continued coal usage until they can get renewable energy that's a base load that's not wood pellets. And so there's just a lot of noise around this industry. And as a result, the industry has been under the microscope since day one. So there are multiple certifications. Sarah is a great person to tap for this because she is an expert on these things, but multiple certifications that are both forest management certifications through the Forest Stewardship Council and Sustainable Forestry Initiative and the Program for the Endorsement of Certifications, as well as chain of custody through those same organizations, which is essentially a certification of the supply chain. Policy has worked its way into these certifications. Most recently, the Sustainable Biomass Program, which is a certification for biomass, solely for biomass, has been basically approved in compliance with RED sustainability requirements, as well as the UK sustainability requirements. So that's a huge boon for them. So you see an evolution. As policy evolves, so are the certifications, so are the third-party auditors, trying to make sure that they're keeping up with the requirements, while at the same time trying to talk a little bit of common sense into those requirements. Because I'm sure many of you are familiar with the EUDR. When it first came out of the gate, it was like everyone's hair was on fire because there was no way that the US could actually be able to assess the compliance with the EU deforestation regulation, even though we have data to prove that we are actually growing forests and not deforesting. Localized bioenergy can be incredibly uh, beneficial across
Yeah.
the board. So it can be beneficial environmentally because it's taking and you're an expert in wildfire resistance, so it's taking wood that might otherwise be a fuel supply to a wildfire. It's using thinnings, it's using materials that are cleaned out of the forest, and much like a garden is weeded, you're managing the forest, making sure that it's not uh, a combustible wildfire opportunity.
Mhm.
And there's benefits economically to the forest owner, to the supply chain, et cetera. So you can talk about the economic benefits as well. When it comes to the combustion, it really does depend on heavily regulated. As much as the current administration doesn't want to regulate, you're still monitored in terms of emissions, and you have to use the best available technology in terms of combustion. Um, and I am not an engineer, and I'm not an expert on the actual the utilities, and there are several different ways of using wood chips and or biomass. Um, but I would say that the carbon argument is does not have a ton of legs to stand on. First of all, the carbon that is emitted, and I mean, you're burning wood, so you're burning carbon. The carbon that is emitted, excuse me, is carbon that is part of our Earth's current carbon cycle. So it's carbon that was recently absorbed and then re-emitted, right? And it is not a net add of pulling carbon out of the middle of the Earth and then adding more carbon than uh, what was already there. So fossilized carbon is adding more. Current carbon is part of the cycle, right? And then in addition to that, wood is proven, and and I'll find you science for this. I can't think of it off the top of my head, but wood is proven to have fewer sulfates, fewer NOx, SOx emissions, etc. When I was at Inviva and then at the association, what we would try to do is bring people that were policymakers that were listening to people that were saying that to the forest. And one of the most impactful things that you can do is take someone to a clear cut that looks like mass murder. It looks like mass devastation, landscape devastation. No one wants to see that. It's not pretty in the eyes of anyone, I would think. However, then and then you talk to the loggers and you see the merchandising happening and it begins to like gel. And then you take them to a clear cut, especially in the US Southeast, maybe not so much in Vermont, but in the US Southeast, you go to a clear cut that's 2 years old, and those trees are going to be my size, and that's like 5 feet 4. So you're going to have a reforestation in relatively little time in the US Southeast. And the other thing to talk about is, to your point, biodiversity. Actually, the harvesting cycles tend to mimic, and if they are done correctly, and I'm not promoting full scale like harvest forests all over the place, right? That's clearly not what I'm promoting, but a sustainable forest management program that actually feeds into multiple markets, including pellets, including paper, including hardwood, is going to benefit the ecosystem as well, because it mimics the Earth's natural processes, right? You've got blowdowns from storms or wildfire, not catastrophic wildfire, but traditional wildfire. Those things don't happen so much anymore because so much of the forest is managed. So we have to actually replicate that one way or the other. Okay, all right. The one thing I want to talk. I talked about some of the policies. Maria had asked me about policy trends. I would say from a broad scope, trends are certainly from Europe, in a constant tango dance between the environmentalists who want to make the restrictions and the sustainability criteria stricter. And now what you're seeing is what's interesting is this populist movement, as scary as it is also pushing back on those strict requirements and promoting more deregulation, even in Europe, which is interesting. And so there's a constant battle. Honestly, I recommend to my clients to stay focused on ESG, to stay focused on their sustainability um, programs and their sustainability initiatives, because ESG is not a political framework, it's really a business framework. And so I actually just wrote a blog about that recently that you can find on my website. But I think it's really important to shut out the noise with regard to the politics and focus on the policy. And does it work for our forests? Does it work for our forest owners? Does it work for our forest supply chain? Both from an environmental standpoint and an economic standpoint. And that's really what you need to focus on and try to like shut out the bombast. What's interesting too is that, and I'm going to try to share my screen as soon as I open up something here. Hold on a second. Is that it? No. I do want to talk a little bit about the future because the subsidies for biomass to large scale energy generation are going to come to an end. 2027 is a year, they may extend it to some extent to prolong the life of utilities that have converted to co-firing or full firing of biomass. But what you're seeing now is a huge interest on the part of aviation companies in what am I trying to say? In sustainable aviation fuel. You're seeing interest in hydrogen, biohydrogen, made from technologies that convert woody biomass into hydrogen and then use that into various applications. You see interesting sort of evolution and developments on the biochemicals end. And the same reasons that made wood pellets a perfect raw material for a coal transition are also feeding into new markets. And so that would be homogeneous, clean raw material. Because it's so dense, it can be easily transported in really large quantities, 100,000 tons at a time in large bulk carriers across the ocean. It can also be sourced sustainably from the US for a variety of reasons that none of you need any explanation for. And so it's really interesting as we see this industry grow, that supply chain for bioenergy was laid in the past 15 years. It's going to be used for many other applications. And you're already seeing movement in the wood pellet industry with the big producers towards sustainable aviation fuel, hydrogen, green lime, green cement. Cement, as you probably know, is one of the highest carbon footprints industrial materials there is. So trying to make that more environmentally friendly and less carbon intensive. Steel making has traditionally used coal to heat and create the steel. And so they're looking at using biomass for their heating source versus coal. So there's a lot going on. And I think as we've seen with the bioenergy market, you'll see policies, hopefully, on the part of different countries that want to develop this and want to be a leader in this transition from fossil fuels and carbon intensive applications to provide policies that support that, both in the form of carrot and stick, like we've seen in the bioenergy aspect. So that's kind of all I have.